welcome. This is terrific to have the chance for you to be with us and sort of share some of your latest thinking and research. I know everyone out there will be eager to hear more about your story and what you're working on. And so if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself and the journey you've been on professionally, and then I'd love to go into some of your thinking and some of the research you're up to and the book that's coming out and lots of exciting stuff.
Great. So I'm Doyne Farmer. I've had a somewhat unusual career. Started as an astrophysicist, then in graduate school built the first wearable computer to beat roulette, which then changed my focus of attention, and I got entranced by what's now called chaos theory.
Yeah.
And so I did that for my PhD thesis. We developed methods for determining whether data was being generated by chaotic attractors or not, and used that for forecasting purposes. And I worked at Los Alamos National Lab for 10 years. While I was there, I started the Complex Systems Group at Los Alamos, and also was involved with the Santa Fe Institute and early days of setting that up. When I was talking about my forecasting work, somebody always asked me, have you tried applying this to the stock market?
Right. Isn't that the first thing all the time, right? Yeah.
I got tired of saying no. And so then I started a company called Prediction Company that was based in Santa Fe. We were one of the earliest quant funds. We did proprietary trading for what eventually became UBS. And I left in '99 to go back to my passion for basic research. They were sold to UBS in 2005. And so then I spent 12 years at the Santa Fe Institute, shifted my focus of attention to economics and finance, and 12 years ago moved to Oxford, where I'm the director of complexity economics for the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School, and Bailey Gifford Professor of Complex System Science in the Smith School for Enterprise and the Environment.
Yeah. And you know, a lot of people may not know Santa Fe Institute. Would you say a few things, and what was sort of the founding idea behind it, and why was it needed?
Yeah. So the Santa Fe Institute was founded by some of the senior fellows at Los Alamos, including, well, George Cowan was the main one, and with help from people like Murray Gilman and Stan Ulam initially. And so the idea was that we really need a place where we can understand complex systems better, which at the time, nobody even knew what that was, but it was clearly a very interdisciplinary thing. Mm. They thought it was better to not have it at Los Alamos, because Los Alamos is in the background of weapons lab. Yeah. So they decided to do it in Santa Fe. I think they also liked an excuse to spend a lot of time in Santa Fe. And so it was set up in 1984, really got going with a real campus in 1986. Or 7, and has an interesting structure in that there's only like 8 people on the residential faculty, but a much larger community that's now grown to about 100 on the external faculty, and was a place where complex systems as a scientific movement was really born.
And you mentioned chaos as well, so you've kind of been at the beginning of a number of sort of important new ideas, chaos among them.
Chaos.
Yeah, and what's the relationship between chaotic systems and complexity?
Chaos is a subset of complex systems. I think complex systems is about information and about structure and form, but chaos is a remarkable thing because you have a deterministic dynamical system, which you would think should be predictable, right, but isn't because of its nonlinear geometric structure. And so chaos is a subset of the broader field of complex systems. It's about turning order into chaos. A lot of the rest of complex systems is about turning chaos into order. One of the things you understand when you even look at chaos is there's structure that can be preserved. My thesis was called Order Within Chaos, and I studied chaotic systems that preserved certain components of order very strongly at the same time that they made other things chaotic.
A mess.
But the big question that complex systems still hasn't solved is how does self-organization happen? How do you get life and intelligence and things like that out of primitive building blocks that don't have life or intelligence? And those are the ultimate emergent phenomena. There are lots of other emergent phenomena too, and we're not going to figure out where intelligence and life came from instantly. It's going to take, my guess is, centuries to resolve that. But meanwhile, there's lots of other problems we can solve, and so complex systems is really about understanding that.
And you mentioned this intersection in your own life between the physics side of things, mathematics side of things, chaos, complexity, and economics?
Yeah. I mean, economics is actually, in a sense, where complex systems thinking was born. Adam Smith said, how can it be, and how does the economy really work? Economy works by specialization. So we all, the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, I think.
Yeah.
We can all be better off if they do what they do well, and we profit from their expertise, to paraphrase him. And that's the basic principle that the economy runs on. But to make that work, we have to put in place institutions that foster coordinating our behavior, like a stable monetary system, like ways of determining what kind of credit is okay and what kind of credit is destabilizing. We have to have the rule of law. We have to deal with monopolies. The rules about monopolies go back to Mesopotamia. They even classified the kind of monopolies. So these problems have been around a long time, and we're slowly figuring out how to run our economy so it works for everybody. But as the world progresses, we get more and more specialized. The things we can do as a community become more and more powerful, and it becomes even more challenging to understand ourselves and guide our activity to make these institutions work for us instead of against us.
Now, one of the things that's interesting in the history here on the Santa Fe Institute is that it seemed the multidisciplinary aspect of it, the system is not just physics. It's ecology, computation, economics, these various disciplines. That seems to be, to your point about specialization, it seems to be an effort to try to look across these disciplines to try to understand a system, which isn't easy from the standpoint of any one piece of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer in interdisciplinary work. My students are drawn from math, geography and the environment, computer science, economics, and I'm about to get one from engineering. So, and I really have seen over and over again, if you put together a team of people that have complementary expertise, but a common interest in making something work, that can develop a vocabulary and language that allows them to communicate with each other, that takes advantage of their specialized knowledge and interest and skills, then you can really make a lot more happen than you can having isolated individuals attack something. And that's a lesson that mainstream economics has not learned very well, but is become widespread. Even in physics, you have papers with 4,000 authors. You discover an elementary particle, you have everybody from the engineer who built the detector to the leader that planned, that got the money to do the experiment. You have teams with diverse skills. Now, I think where we've been lacking most as a society is in doing things that really require serious cross-cutting interdisciplinary activity that our system just doesn't make happen very naturally right now, because academia is so siloed and the chasms between those silos are vast. And so we need people who can attack the problems that sit in those chasms. And that's really what I've tried to do through my whole career. I've worked in math, physics, theoretical biology, computer science, and now economics. So,
does I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier, which is what makes this moment in time particularly interesting from being able to wrestle with these complex systems problems, whether it's the economy, as you said, or you and I have a shared passion around the challenges of the economic transition within climate and sustainability. What is it about right now?
Well, right now, we've been enabled. We have the computer power we need. We could model the world at one-to-one scale at the level of individual households or even people. And we can do it in a way where we're not violating everybody's confidentiality. We can model, millions of different businesses, and we have increasingly greater amounts of data to ground such models so they make sense empirically. And so we have the tools at our disposal to do something that, Herbert Simon in the 1960s could really only dream about. And so we can do economics in a completely different way than mainstream economists learn to do it, because that whole way of doing things developed, in the 50s and 60s when the computational power and data were simply not there. And I would even add knowledge about individual human beings. Social science has progressed a lot since the 1960s. We understand much better the universal patterns in the way people behave and the variety of behaviors which we can faithfully represent with computers in a way that is very hard to do with pure mathematics.
And this, you're almost arguing that there's our ability to get the granularity, the deep insight on the granularity of the economic, physical, human, social system is what has the potential to give us insights at the system level that we haven't been able to get before.
Getting the granularity right is just one of the things that you have to do. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. The harder part is really empirically grounding a model so that you understand that it actually works. And because it's easy to make up models that do stuff, it's much harder to make up models that do stuff that you know you can trust. And that's where you really need the data, so that you can take part of the data to build a model and hold back part of the data to test the model, and where you can micro-found the model by taking each one of the pieces and grounding them against data at the level of the pieces, like your model for households. Well, how do households behave? You can go look at census data and see how households behave. Look at commercial data for how they behave. Look at lots of kinds of data to model the way the households behave. Have another set of data for how do the firms behave. And then you put the model together and you see what emerges, and then you test the model at the level of aggregate quantities like unemployment and GDP and so on. Whereas in mainstream economics, you try and model things up at that level from the beginning. It'd be like if, to understand weather, we try to build a model for global mean temperature and global CO2 levels, we wouldn't get anywhere with that. Models of the weather and climate are limited by the granularity with which you can build a model. Though the granularity isn't sufficient, but it's a necessary step. And then you have to get the physics right for a weather model. You have to get the economics right, meaning both the accounting and the sociological interactions with economic activities that allows you to predict what the economy is going to do depending on what happens through time.
Yeah. Now, we had a very unfortunate, totally shared experience with COVID.
Yeah.
And it threw everything up.
Yeah.
And it created an environment where I don't think anybody could actually predict what was going to happen. We weren't sure we knew there were going to be bad impacts on economies, but I don't know if anybody could really do it. However, your team actually did what I think is a fascinating piece of work. Could you talk more about that? Because I think, to your point, there's some balance here between getting granular, getting things that work, and then having an impact on the system, if you will.
Yeah. No, the COVID, from our point of view, was a great testing case for what we could do, because when COVID started to happen, it was clear even before any lockdowns happened that this was something that was going to sweep over the world and was going to shut the economy down as we tried to cope with it. And so I put together a team of my best people, and we did a crash program where for a couple of months we just worked literally around the clock, because we had somebody in Australia so that we could hand work to her and she could hand it back to us at the end of the next day. And you know, everybody was locked down, but we'd have a video call every day. And we realized that this is a case where the kind of models we build should be able to shine, because the shock was going to be huge, it was going to be really sudden, and so traditional equilibrium models were just not suited. It was also clear that it was very heterogeneous. It was going to hit different sectors of the economy very differently. And I had a couple of people on my team, Maria Del Rio Chinona and Penny Mealy, who were real experts on occupational labor and its relationship to industry, so that we could predict ahead of time which industries were going to be shut down because the workers would not be able to go to work. So we put together a prediction for a remote labor index that turned out to be really good. So we actually predicted the shocks ahead of time, because we could predict which industries would be thwarted because they didn't have enough labor. And then we built a model that tracked the way the shocks were going to reverberate around the economy and how they were going to interact, because we knew that companies were going to be shut down if they didn't have the labor, they didn't have the raw materials, or they didn't have the demand. So we just put those things into the model. We were lucky because IHS Markit pro bono did a survey for us in a week, where they asked all their industry analysts, if you have to go without, which inputs can you go without for 2 months without having a large effect on industrial output? So we knew what the essential inputs were for each industry. So, and that turned out to be critical, because we had an accurate production function that was accurate industry by industry.
So each of these industries, in some sense, was an agent in your model.
Yeah, each of the industries is. We modeled it because for convenience purposes here, the sweet spot was to model at a sectoral level. So we had 52 sectors with a representative firm in each sector, and then we could model what its output was going to be day by day. The model ran on a daily time scale. We got data on the inventories so we could watch how the inventories were getting chewed up, and then we could see when you hit a critical place where the industry either ran out of inventories because stuff it needed wasn't getting produced, or it didn't have the labor to produce it, or nobody wanted their product, so they had to stop producing. And we could look at how all the 52 industries were interacting through time. And so we made a model that successfully predicted the second quarter of 2020 GDP hit for the UK. We predicted 21.5%. When the dust settled, the right answer was 22.1%.
Not bad.
And it was pretty good. And we predicted more or less right, industry by industry. And on a post-mortem, we could see, you know, where do we get things right? And for example, having the right production function made a huge difference. If we'd been wrong in either direction, our predictions would have been a lot worse. So we think it's a nice proof of principle that these complexity economics models.
Yeah, let me interrupt you just for a second,
sure.
because you were talking about kind of the aggregate outcome
of
GDP contraction at the 21.5%. But given that you modeled these individual industries and the way they would evolve, how many of those, if you will, individual industries were you able to get pretty close to in terms of the way they were involved, given you described this tight connection between labor, the various inputs for production, and the connection between them?
Well, we got about an 80% correlation between the industries that we predicted would, you know, go up or down relative to, actually, most of them were either going down or holding flat, but the discrepancy was huge. Some industries went up, stayed flat, weren't affected much. Others, you know, their output went down by more than 50%. So it's a very heterogeneous system or set of outcomes. And if you just make the scatter plot of predicted versus actual, we got about 80% correlation. We got a few things wrong. You know, we predicted healthcare would go up, but actually went down a bit because of routine procedures being delayed. But by and large, we got stuff right.
I think
and by the way, we got the time course right too. The profile of the recovery we got pretty much right. And I should also say our predictions were conditional on the policies the government would enact. And so the paper we sent to the government, UK government, said, if you guys do this, this is what we think the economy will do. If you do this instead, this is what the economy will do. And we pointed out there was a sweet spot where if you kept all the upstream industries open, but you closed the downstream customer-facing industries, then you only had incrementally more deaths than you did from a complete lockdown, but the economy remained much more healthy than it would be from a complete lockdown.
I mean, it strikes me that sort of insight at the kind of the granular level is a whole different way to inform policymaking. I don't even know how you get at the levers at the macro level that would suggest, hey, here's where that sweet spot really is. Maybe retrospectively, everybody could look and say, well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we think about value chains and we think about human risk, but you need some sort of confidence as a policymaker that there's a basis to this, beyond the politics, there's a basis to take particular actions. What you're describing sounds quite kind of revolutionary in terms of the insight that one could have at this economic system level.
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, I think it's important to go down to a more granular level for several reasons. One is you can make predictions about a lot of things that you couldn't predict otherwise because, you want to have an aggregate prediction, but if you're in a given sector, you care about what your sector is going to do.
Absolutely.
And your sector may behave completely differently than some other sector. So we can make predictions that you can't make with an aggregate model. But secondly, you have a lot more data to test on. So we're in the process of writing a more theoretical paper about this right now. But if you think about what happens in a typical aggregate macro model, you take, a few indicators, GDP, unemployment, inflation, interest rates. So you have a few time series that you don't measure that accurately, that are highly correlated from quarter to quarter, and you only have 10 or 12 business cycles since World War II that are remotely relevant to what's happening now. You take all that data and you compress it with an algorithm. My guess is you might have 500 bytes of information, maybe 1,000 bytes, and yet you're trying to model the macroeconomy, which is a complicated beast. It's telling you that you have more than 2 or 3 parameters. You're not going to be able to estimate them very well from that data. Now, if you start doing micro data, you have a lot more data to fit your model on. And so instead of ramming the world through this information bottleneck and then trying to predict what's going on, you take the richness of that micro scale and you try and model that. The key is to do it in a parsimonious way so you don't overfit what's happening. So there's 2 big advantages to going down to the micro scale. And then you have a lot more ways to test whether what you're doing is working right. And if you see that, this sector, we're not getting that right, that's your bottleneck. You need to zero in, figure out what's wrong with that part of the model and fix it. So, I'm a firm believer that if my model can't make predictions that are correct through time, why should I believe any of its, if I do a counterfactual, what if we implemented this policy, why should I believe it's true if it's not already predicting things under, the non-counterfactual, the normal world, day in, day out? I think, the great example, again, to go back to weather and climate, weather models are really well tested because we've been testing them every day for decades, day in and day out around the world in a micro way. We know exactly how well they work. Then we can have some confidence if we do a counterfactual that we're getting things right. We don't know, but it's a lot better to start with a baseline that's solid than to start with a baseline that's already bullshit. And unfortunately, I think that's the way it's been in economic modeling. Now, this is a revolution in economics because in mainstream economics, models are derived by assigning everybody a utility function and deriving the set of decisions that maximizes everybody utility, with everybody taking everybody else into account. And whereas we're saying, let's do things completely differently. Let's take behavioral models that are built by observing how people behave. Let's put them into a simulation of economic activity that's inherently dynamic, where every day the agents make some decisions as best they can using heuristics and limited reasoning. They're boundedly rational, like real people. We try and mimic the key mechanisms of the economy as closely as we can with what I call verisimilitude. So it ought to smell right. It ought to feel like, yeah, that's about what people do. So we don't have to use as-if arguments. And then we model the dynamics of the economy. People make decisions. They interact with each other. That gives rise to economic outcomes. That influences the decisions people make. And we go around the dynamical loop again and again. We might converge to an equilibrium, or we might not.
If you sort of play this forward and you say there are more predictable times than others, right? A lot of times based on our intuition and our histories and our ability to reason through given those the situations we've learned over time. Then there are periods that are huge disruptions. And one could argue that in disruptive periods, there's probably more nonlinear effects at work. Those things are seldom intuitive to many people. And so your risk in terms of being able to reason effectively through times of disruption or times of rapid change or times where many, many things are changing at the same time, you know, you should be skeptical of your ability to get that right. But it sounds like what you're saying is if we can actually apply the technology and the science that we've accumulated over time and have built over time in complexity economics, complexity science, and apply our computational capacity at more and more highly resolved levels, that we actually can deal with these more sudden changes. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the big advantages of agent-based modeling, which is really just the term for simulation in the social sciences, called agent-based modeling because you have to deal with the fact that there are people making decisions and they have agency. So, you know, it's not like an atom. An atom has to do what the laws of physics tell it to do.
What was that quote? What was that quote that one of your founder had once, Murray Gell-Mann? What did he say about particles? You know, physics would be extremely difficult if, what was that? If particles had their own minds or something?
If atoms had their own minds, it would be much, much harder. And so we have to deal with that. And that's always the most difficult part. But, you know, by using a simulation, we can deal with all those nonlinearities because there's nonlinearities that make mathematics hard. When you have lots of nonlinearities, solving for these optima becomes, you get a rugged landscape. Solving for the optima becomes particularly difficult. But in a simulation, this stuff is relatively easier. And unlike, you know, if you're trying to do, you might say, oh, well, why don't you just use machine learning?
Why not? I mean, we're all talking about it, right?
So 2 reasons not to use machine learning. First is the economy is slow. So it's not like, you know, it's not something where you have data sets with millions of data points. You have data sets with often only hundreds of data points. And so if you're just going to fit a nonlinear model to the raw data, you just don't have enough data to pin that model down. But the second one is that any statistical approach, whether it be classic econometrics or statistical modeling or machine learning, they're both just different flavors of the same thing. You rely on the world, the future being like following the same patterns that it followed in the past. And if those patterns change, all bets are off because the function you're fitting in the underlying machine learning model can become wrong. Whereas in an agent-based model, okay, you can still have problems with those kind of non-stationarities, but because you're trying to get at the causal mechanisms that are underlying what's going on, you can first of all build a model where you have a lot more prior knowledge built in, so you can get that model to work with a lot less data. And secondly, you can do what-if experiments where because you've understood the causal mechanisms, you have a much better chance of understanding what will happen when you take a course that veers off the course you've been on. Now, of course, you have to make sure, and COVID would be another example, where, you know, I don't think we understood the way people were going to react socially, the whole anti-vax thing, those would have been tough for us to do. So it's not like this is a panacea, we can do everything. And one of the things I learned about science is the art is to figure out what you can predict and what you can't predict. So the reason our COVID model worked, one of the reasons it pretty mechanical effect. You know, the shocks hit the economy because of who wasn't going to be able to go to work, and those shocks propagated around the economy in a very mechanical way. Understanding the anti-vaxxers would require a much more sophisticated understanding of social mechanisms. I'd love to understand that someday, but part of what you want to do is start with the things that are much more mechanical. Like, I think the energy transition is pretty darn mechanical. Maybe to put an asterisk by that, well, only after you understand technological change, where you can understand the innovations that are going to, you can't predict this is going to be the new innovation. What you can predict is this new innovation is probably going to perform about here, that is, it's probably going to be an improvement about this size.
Let's go there for a little bit, because I think I think in this period of time, we have this massive change ahead of us in terms of the energy transition and sustainability transition, food system transition, material transitions, right? And this notion you just mentioned of sort of deep insight into the, if you will, the physics and the behavior of technologies within systems as they mature, as they scale. Say more about your research in this area, because I think you've done some fascinating both look-backs and forward forecasts that pretty much resulted in an opinion that you developed about how expensive this energy transition was going to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Gordon Moore was, a great visionary when he said, this is the rate at which integrated circuits are going to shrink. And of course, integrated circuit shrinking drives the cost, it drives the energy usage, it drives the speed. So you shrink it, you get all three for free once you've done that. And he made a prediction in 1965 that he amended a little bit later, and it's held true until now, remarkably well. An even earlier pioneer was Theodore Wright, who predicted that there's a relationship between decreasing cost and increasing experience as measured by cumulative production that the Boston Consulting Group made a lot of use of in its early days. So these are things that went before that made it clear that, look, these are rules about predicting the future. But people didn't realize for a long time that Moore's law doesn't just apply to semiconductors. There are versions of that for lots of other things.
Other technologies.
Other technologies. Some technologies basically over a century hardly improve at all. Other technologies like transistors improve dramatically by a factor of 1 billion, as in contrast by factors of less than 5. And so it's remarkably simple to just measure that and make these forecasts. To do it right, though, you need to understand how good the forecasts are. That's the contribution we made, is coming up with a good algorithm for predicting not just what we thought was likely to happen, but what are the error bars on that? What's the probabilistic forecast where we were able to collect data, make 6,000 different forecasts and derive how accurately we thought those forecasts were and show that our method actually predicted how accurate the forecasts were. Across
family of technologies.
50 different technologies going through time. And so that's been a key driver of the rest of our work, because just as Moore's law was an extremely useful thing because it forecast, if you know where the industry is going to be in 5 years, then you can plan to meet targets that are going to be there in 5 years. One of my favorite stories is from my friend Alvy Ray Smith, who's one of the founders of Pixar, a fellow New Mexican. And so Alvy told me that basically 5 years before they made Toy Story, they pretty much had all the software ready, but they just didn't have the computer power. So they could say to Jobs, look, just 5 years, give it 5 years, we're going to be all ready to make real movies with this. So they perfected it, but they really needed to just wait for Moore's law to catch up to them. And So, and that happens in many different spheres. Similarly, for the tech transition, if we can provide roadmaps to where the technologies are going to be at different points in time with the likelihoods they're going to be there, then we can plan the energy transition in a sensible and effective manner. And businesses will be able to understand where things are going to be and arrange their goals to be in the right place at the right time.
Is this sort of behind the reason why consistently forecasts about adoptions and cost and technology performance of solar and wind have been wrong year in and year out?
There's several reasons, in my view, those forecasts have been wrong. The conventional integrated assessment models and their cousins, like the IEA model, are built around the idea that you've got, first of all, they ask a different question. They ask the question, what is the optimal route in terms of maximizing discounted consumption?
Right.
For if we adopt a given target for how much emissions we're going to release, what is the optimal plan to get there? So right away, you've got something that's not really empirically verifiable, because if you say, well, look, have you predicted what's been happening? They'll say, well, but we don't know what plan we're on. What scenario are we following? And we're just predicting the optimum. Do we know that the world is following the optimum? Whereas we say, well, let's look at historical trends. Let's take empirical things we understand and ask, can we predict what's likely to happen? And then policy-wise, can we nudge it in a good direction to make it a little better, or maybe even a lot better? But let's start by understanding the underlying patterns so that we have something we can test. And that's key. You've always got to have something you can test so you know whether it's any good. And so, we really just asked a different question, and we attacked it with a very different set of methods, and we were able to test those methods incrementally and show that they were the right ones, and that gives us some confidence that going forward, we have a lot more reason to believe what we've said than what they've said. And by the way, they missed by an order of magnitude at least, consistently underestimating how quickly renewable technologies were going to be deployed and how cheap they were going to get.
Yeah. And if we could sort of dive a little bit deeper on this, because if I recall correctly, I think you were interviewed a couple times on the BBC, and I think you wrote a little bit about this as well. And it was a view that because of this foresight that these technology maturing curves offered, and in terms of their consequences on cost and everything, you could have a view about, well, you think the energy transition is going to cost you this much, but if we play this forward over a reasonable period of time, there's a lot of improvement ahead, which means this is actually a pretty smart, positive economic move to make. Could you talk more about that? Did I get that right?
But no, you got it right. Okay. You got it right. It's interesting because the integrated assessment modelers knew, at least the more sophisticated ones, and it took them a while to get that in there, but they were aware that technologies tend to improve. Though initially, I have to say, they made poor assumptions. I remember talking to some people at Potsdam Institute for Climate Change, one of the leading models, Remind, and their assumption that they were predicting all the technologies were going to improve in about the same way. I said, well, wait a minute. That's not what history says. Fossil fuel technologies aren't going to improve. Solar energy, PV solar energy, is going to improve. And so, okay, they fixed that. But then they'd say, well, but if we run our model, what does it want to do? It wants to do nothing but build solar farms. So, that can't be the right answer. So, okay, we'll put a floor cost in. So once the prices hit here, they'll hit the floor cost and they won't improve anymore. We'll put in deployment constraints so they can't deploy faster than this rate. And so that handicaps them and lets the CCS and other technologies keep in the running. And we have a plot in our paper showing how those floor costs just got punched through again and again and again. They would lay out a floor cost, and then the technology would knock right through it. And they've done that many, many times now.
And that can sort of skew our whole worldview of how this energy transition can happen.
Yeah. So So the fact that they made these auxiliary assumptions in the end meant that their models were wrong.
And this notion that, hey, wait, government, you don't understand. You put the right time frame on this.
Yeah.
And actually, it more than pays for itself.
Yeah. So, yeah, let me come back and answer your question properly. So, whereas these guys are predicting all these roadblocks, we said, well, let's just look at what the data is telling us. And the data tells you, we looked at 50 technologies. They have exponential trends for decreasing prices. Once those trends are set in place, things fluctuate around them. Solar's been a decade
right.
more or less flat, but there's a long-range trend that things tend to revert back to, and whereas others are saying, well, okay, solar's now as cheap as these other technologies. Our prediction is it's going to keep getting cheaper. And so even when you put a strong discount rate on the future, the numbers are such that now we actually come out ahead economically by transitioning to renewables. That is, even if there were no greenhouse gases, it would be of great benefit to society to make this transition just to make energy
on a
cheap.
Pure economic
just to make energy
basis.
cheap.
Yeah.
Not to mention, we get better energy security, we get rid of pollution, we get all kinds of auxiliary co-benefits. And of course, the big one is dramatically reducing climate change.
Yeah. And this ability to, if you will, continuously advance, if you will, the science of prediction through both deep inspection of the past as well as smart modeling of the future, granularity. These strike me in combination as incredibly important right now, given what we're trying to do. If I'm an investor putting money to work and I want to recognize these are these rare opportunities to take advantage of a massive economic transition, or I'm a company in an industry, and I'm recognizing my industry, the competitive order is likely to get restacked here, and the ability of my factories in one part of the world versus the other are likely to get reshaped by the capacity to make these transitions differently in different countries. Or if I'm a policymaker, gracious, what really should I be incentivizing, and how much should I do it? And am I really getting the sequence right? It sounds like what you're talking about ought to be something we are incredibly excited about grabbing hold of. It's in some ways, it's a technology that we should be applying to the energy transition.
Yeah, well, you're preaching the choir here.
I know it's just exciting. It's exciting to think about, because I don't know if we think about that kind of computational and analytical technology is actually being part of and integral to our ability to guide this transition. The thing that's always puzzled me, I love your thinking on this. The market will take care of it. The free market will sort this all out. And yet, we sort of have a ticking clock here. There are tipping points,
right?
Which would strike me as we need to perhaps guide this thing a little more tightly than the market will sort it out. How do you kind of think about that? The sort of, well, you don't understand, this is the magic of the market. The market will allocate capital correctly. I think we have a lot of examples of where maybe that doesn't work.
No, I mean, on one hand, I think we're really lucky that just when we really need it, we have the new technologies that we need to deal with fossil fuel emissions and climate change. But it's not like the market just magically takes care of it all. We've benefited from, cost price supports from lots of governments, research efforts funded by governments, the technology to really get long-range, deep research. You really need governments to get behind it, need policymakers to back it up. We're lucky that we've reached a point where we are at that tipping point where renewables can more or less fly on their own, though we still have, we need to make sure that we get things like hydrogen storage cheap so that we can deal with the whole problem and not just part of the problem. So we need to keep pushing them, but we have the advantage that the economy is now really starting to work for us. We have the wind at our back. Dealing with climate change is no longer the horrible, the seeming burden it used to be. the thinking used to be, oh, climate change is a really big burden. We've got to figure out who's gonna bear that burden.
Huge cost.
Or it's a hot potato that everybody passed around. And that was the whole philosophy behind these earlier integrated assessment models. Whereas now we go, well, actually, since renewables are taking off, since they're going to make energy cheaper than it's ever been, it's actually a huge economic opportunity. And now it's a race for businesses and for nation states to position themselves to take advantage of this change that's going to make things better for everybody in many dimensions.
Could I talk to you about...
And it's going to involve huge profits.
There we go.
Point.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could I ask you about this concept of SIPs or strategic intervention points, or however you like to think about it? But if I have true visibility, or at least strong testable hypotheses about the system, how do I use this notion of nudges and SIPs and kicks in order to accelerate what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah. Well, so there's a great picture. I don't know if it ever made it in our final paper, but there was a great example where NASA had a satellite that was in an orbit around the Earth, and they decided, I'm forgetting now, they wanted to send it off to Jupiter or somewhere. So they waited till it was just in the right point of its orbit, and they gave it a little kick.
Little nudge, huh?
And it made this amazingly complicated orbit that went and landed it right where they wanted to go. In other words, they got a huge change by applying a very small stimulus at just the right point. And this is something you often see, going back to my chaos background.
Yeah, exactly.
You often see in chaotic systems, because of the nonlinearities, if you want to control chaos, you can take advantage of the places where things are actually very sensitive to what's going on, to give them little nudges to get them to go to a very different place. And so the idea of a sensitive intervention point is to understand the system well enough that you know how to nudge it to get it to do what you want it to do, instead of falling into some tipping point that takes you to a state you really don't want to be in. And right now we're at a place like that with the climate, where if we just passively sit there, we're going to end up with who knows what, 2.5, 3 degrees worse. But if we do the right things, and it won't actually cost that much. In fact, we can make a profit while we do it. But we still need some policymakers making some key nudges. If we make those right nudges, we can steer the system to be in a much better place much faster.
So we should be using every possible tool to reason this through, or model this through, or predict this.
We shouldn't delude ourselves. We have to keep humility. We shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking our predictions are better than they are. Scientists throughout history have always erred on the side of being overconfident about how much predictability they have. But on the other hand, we should make use of the predictability we know we have in order to try and steer the system and steer society. The analogy, I like to think that science is giving us the opportunity to make a conscious civilization. So we can do things like look out at the sky and scan for asteroids and be ready, so if we see that asteroid, we can come up and perturb its orbit enough that it doesn't kill us. Climate change is a great example. By understanding the Earth's weather, then we reach a point where we can understand the climate, where we can see something that's really more of a problem 50 years out than it is now and anticipate it. Now, then we have to deal with the social systems to cope with what's happening. We have to deal with the economics of that. That is, we have to be able to model the way we ourselves affect the world that we live in. Consciousness is all about having a model of yourself, right? So we have to become a conscious civilization that understands itself and our collective behavior well enough to anticipate what's going to happen if we take different choices, and so that we can guide ourselves into better choices.
And I believe you have colleagues who've really advanced the modeling of social dynamics, social systems, using some of these same techniques, right? But with a deep lens on collective behavior. Emergent behavior is the sum of the way societies work. So we can bring these worlds together, like sort of the physical long supply chains around the globe, the technology changes, and the social systems now with technology that helps us at least get closer into our ability to at least reason more clearly about the future.
Yeah, you know, our understanding of these things is really advancing right now because we can now collect data about behavior on a scale that social scientists couldn't even imagine 20 years ago. We have big data sets that involve records of how people behave. And we have the computational power to analyze them. And so, and we have emerging theories for how these things behave. I mean, it's striking that something as basic as the Ising model in physics, where you have little magnetic spins that can flip up and down, can be turned into a model for opinion dynamics that helps you understand why polarization occurs and gives you some hints about how to keep it from occurring. And so these are all nascent things. We still have a long way to go, but I think there's great potential for them to really provide powerful tools going forward.
Could I go into one or two other areas? You're just not thinking about this stuff. I mean, you're literally committed to actually, as you did with the prediction company, creating a capability here that can help us. Can you say more about that, or would you prefer not at this stage?
No, I mean, it's been since I beat roulette and when I was a graduate student.
With a wearable computer under each arm?
Yeah, well, computer under one arm and 12 AA batteries under the other arm with, you know, a 3 kilobyte program.
Machine code.
Machine coded,
Yeah.
you know, 3 kilobyte program that I hand coded myself. But I mean, I love to predict things. It's just fun.
Yeah.
And so with Prediction Company, it was a similar challenge. But okay, those were fun, but this is something where the stakes are much bigger. You know, I was influenced by reading the Foundation trilogy, and I've always wanted to be a mini version of Harry Seldon ever since I read that when I was 16.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a great adventure, but it's something we really need, and something where, you know, I'm older now, but I've had the luxury of having remarkable students at Oxford who can do all these things and really carry everything forward with great energy and competence, and been able to assemble a team of people that I know are capable of doing this, that work well together, and we want to do it to, you know, we'd like to make a little money, but we really want to make the world better because we think this is needed.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all going to be watching with enthusiasm about your ability to move this forward and in a much needed technology to help us navigate all of this, and certainly to get more insight into the real economy and the choices that can be made during this transition. I guess if people wanted to learn more, if I'm not mistaken, you have a book coming out. Can you say a little bit?
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about the book? Or, yeah, I know it's not out yet, but maybe just what's it going to cover? And
the date that Penguin has given me is April 25th, 2024.
There we go.
So it's coming out soon. I mean, I've worked on this book for 10 years, so I'm very glad to see it coming out. The book is really about what we've just been talking about in this interview. Pretty much, this interview is almost a summary of what's in the book. The book maybe talks a bit more about the financial system than we have here. In addition to talking about technology and macroeconomics, I also talk a lot about why is the financial system so unstable. Short answer is leverage. Leverage, we need it, but it's a very dangerous thing because it can be a big destabilizer. And you know, why does the market change all the time in the way? So I think we have some glimmers about market turbulence and so on. But yeah, I'd be very pleased if anybody reads my book.
Terrific. So that's April.
April
Penguin.
25. The title of the book is
This is the hardest thing for an author. Is got to keep that title in mind.
Yeah. Making sense out of chaos, a better economics for a better world.
Super. So we will make sure all of you have the opportunity to, when that book comes out, to be reminded of it, and certainly to know where to go to get it. And again, I think for all of us who are passionate about the energy transition economy and sustainability, and how this is can fundamentally reshape the trajectory of the world, we're happy to hear there are new tools and computational resources that we can apply in new ways to give us a better chance than just banging along.